who or what is on the other side? Is it God? Is it spirit? Is it everything? What are people experiencing?
We are God's toys or playthings. They say, well, I was on the other side and it's more real than this. She said, Dr. Moody, I have never been so alive as when I heard that doctor say I was dead.
Can't we start to train ourselves to live the two-phase process now?
Opens your mind and the world is never again the same. When you wonder whether God exists, you're trying to draw a circle around God. Think about that. And God is bigger than existence itself.
Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wondered if there's life after death, then do we have the Life After Life show for you. Today I'll be talking with one of my all-time favorite guests and human beings, Dr. Raymond Moody, most recently author of God is Bigger Than the Bible and Making Sense of Nonsense, who first coined the term NDE in 1975 and has written book after book on the topic. He's the father of NDEs and the leading worldwide expert. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about near-death experiences, what they mean, and what's coming when we die. That plus we'll talk about one of the most profound discoveries that's taken place with NDEs in science just before the end, so you're going to want to stay tuned. So welcome back to the show, Raymond. Are you ready to shine?
Well, I am just so ready, and I have such a great time with you, Michael. So thank you for this invitation, and thanks to the folks who are listening in, too.
Well, thank you so much, and a mighty woohoo!
Yeah.
So before we dive right into things, do we know now, 45 years after coming up with the term NDE, do we definitively know there's life after death?
Well, what I say, Michael, is that I was not raised in a religious situation. To me, the idea of an afterlife is still very counterintuitive. And yet, I've just reached a point in my life where I give up. There's just, I think the standard debate about these things, right, is, well, these people who have the cardiac arrest, it's oxygen deprivation to the brain. And that is something that there's a certain kind of person who's just got to hang on to something like that because the alternative is scary. But what I would say is, no, this is not oxygen deprivation to the brain for several reasons, but most practically because bystanders who are not ill or injured themselves will have this same experience during a death process. Or people say that as their loved ones die, they get out of their body, they accompany their loved ones part way to this light. And I have plenty of physician friends who have empathically co-lived the near-death experiences of their patients in these astonishing ways. And so, I am a skeptic in the genuine sense. People who they say, oh, I'm a skeptic about near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. That's not what skepticism is. Ancient Greek philosophy was my thing. And the skeptical idea is to vigorously inquire, but to withhold a conclusion. So I can't draw a logical conclusion. And I would not try to persuade anybody else of my my attitude I've arrived at, but I give up. I don't know what else to say, is that there's an afterlife. And I wouldn't say that, Michael, unless there was some sort of conceptual scheme in the background. And what I want to claim here and now, and this is something that is everybody can verify this for yourself. There is a process you can go by where you can learn to think very rigorously about the afterlife. But David Hume, who you might have encountered, he was one of the 18th century philosopher who sort of explored the notion of causation. He was a formative influence in the origin of what we call the scientific mind. Einstein was influenced by Hume, for example. And what Hume said accurately is By the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Now, that's an understatement. And he went on to say, some new species of logic is required for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. What he was getting at is the reality is we can't solve the afterlife question with the mind we got now and the logic we got now. But Hume was implying that it's impossible. I say it's fairly easy to do, that we can expand our minds and add to our logical principles of thinking in such way we open a whole new way of investigating this. So I say personally, from my process, yes, there's an afterlife. I wouldn't try to it, convince anybody else this, but what I can say is there's a process available, and I lay it out in my book, Making Sense of Nonsense, which is a condensation of course that I taught, and that by going through that and working the exercises, people will open their minds in startling new ways that has lots of practical significance too. People in advertising have told me it's benefited. I mean, just medicine. But one of the things is that it reformats your mind such that when you have subsequently a near death experience, you'll be able to back to tell the rest of us about it. And that it's and so, on that basis, I say there is a conceptual scheme easily learned by people that enables us now comfortably to say, yes, number one, personally, I accept it. There is. And that secondly, people can open their minds in such a way to think about it logically and to actually interact with their near death experiences. It's already happened. This wonderful scientist and renowned artist who went to one of my seminars, then he came back and he said, absolutely. He said, you're right. You can open your mind in such a way as you can think about it. Because he had a near death experience and it worked for him. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I want to dive into NDEs in more detail, and we're going to come around to Hume again just before the end. But it's interesting. My wife Jessica is almost by my side here, and she's almost always by my side, and I love it. And she is a Chinese American. She grew up bilingual. Actually, Chinese was her first language. English is her second language. And what it gives her is more of a breadth or more of a palette from which to paint. And what you are describing to me, because I teach in automatic writing, how to write nonsense and make nonsense or make sense of the nonsenses you're describing.
Yes, exactly.
What we're talking about here is that the given languages that we have don't have the conceptual words in order to describe. Going to Dr. Eben Alexander, we've had on many times, has the most amazing quote in the world, a neuroscientist who says there is no proof of life after life. Consciousness only exists in the brain. Then he died for a week. Hello. And then he comes back and he says, and this is the best nonsense. It was more real than real.
Real. Absolutely. I hear that from people all over the world, Michael. And the thing is, it's the technical objection, and I'll try not to be dry about this, but people who think about the afterlife question not from the point of view of wanting to believe it or having some pre-existing opinion or wanting to prove it, but who just use logic to think it through, come to the same conclusion, which the logical positivist about the beginning of the 20th century pointed this out magnificently. It's like, yes, when we say life after death, images come up in our mind. We feel good. There's vague images there. But once you start to on a conceptual process of pinning it down, one of the great logical positivists said, it's like you realize the whole concept is self contradictory. But that's not a trouble. I mean, it's just a way of working through how to think about it. And once you do, this is opening up. I mean, I'm confident to say, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back or propound a new belief system, but it's to issue a challenge. I say, I've made, and not personally me, but there is a major breakthrough in the genuine rational investigation of life after death. If you're serious about the question, You have to go through first a conceptual process about how to think about these things. Then you come back to them, and it's a whole new era but it's not going to go over well sometimes with what I call the afterlife establishment. I mean, people who've already set in their ways about doing this. But if we just open up our minds and say, hey, we can think logically about things that don't make sense, then we've got we've got our foot in the door. Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Speaking, so I'm gonna kind of dovetail off of that. We're gonna double back all the way to I'm forgetting the word for it. I'm going to call them paddles at the moment. The ability to resuscitate somebody. That radically changed modern resuscitation techniques. I mean, this has been, NDEs have been described all the way back since Plato, but it radically changed the number of people who had NDEs once we could resuscitate them. And now I've heard statistics, and I can't believe this is true. Up to 8% of people have had NDEs. Does that sound right to you?
Well, it sounds counterintuitive even to this day, but what happened, Michael? This has been a long process for me. I found out about these when I was 18 years old, reading Plato. Then I met somebody 3 years later who actually had one. He was a professor of psychiatry there at UVA, and then subsequently going through my PhD in philosophy and subsequently medical school, interviewed lots of people. Well, when it got up to about 1970, I was a professor of philosophy at East Carolina University. And so I talked to my students and my colleagues who had these experiences. And so I began to talk about it in my classes. Word spread in this little town, and of course the civic clubs, right? Every town has them, the Kiwanis or the Lions Club, or they have to have a speaker every Wednesday or whatever. So all these clubs, and once one ask they all ask you. So I was there, and these were the movers and shakers in this little town. I mean, these were the mayor and all the people who ran the businesses and the respected people. And this was an all male arena at that time, sadly, but that's the way it was. But it never failed, Michael. Every one of these. The people would come up afterward and say, "Yeah, Dr. Moody, I've never told anybody this, but." So, yeah, as strange as it may seem that 8% of our people have, from their point of view, been to the other side, it's something that checks out very well I used to challenge people. I said, just ask around among your own friends. I was Shortly after After Life was published, I got this urgent communication from a psychiatrist, and he said he was on a plane and he picked up my book in the airport and he was reading it. And he said, how can this be? I've been in medicine a long time. I never heard about this, but this is amazing. And he said he kept saying that he was reading the part about how if you just ask around among your friends, you'll see this. So he said he noticed this lady to the left kept kind of looking over his shoulder, and he turned to her and she said, "What's that book about?" And he told her the first, and her eyes lit up, and she said, "And let me finish." Like after you go through eternity and see this light. And he said, "Yeah," and that's how it is. It's astonishing to think that it's so widespread, but that's the reality. It is. Yeah.
How much do people change when they come back? And I'm biased, having had two NDEs myself. I call them NDEs light. I was given the decision, but they didn't take me down the tunnel. Probably they kept me away from the light because it would have been a different decision. But how much? I know how much I changed. I say the me who was died. Plain and simple. I'm gone. I was a goner. The me who came back is completely different. Same. I didn't have my woohoo beforehand. None of this stuff. None of my laugh, my giggle, none of it. How much do people change after an NDE?
They just change enormously. It's like a 180 degrees. And what I found out in my psychiatry residency, which you've observed too, I'm sure, with everybody. Look, Michael, everybody's chasing something, right? It's like some people chase money, some people chase power, some people chase fame, or all of these things. I was so amazed that all of my patients were chasing something that I went into my supervisor and I said, John, what's wrong with me? All these people are chasing something. Me, I'm fine with what you're doing. He said, Raymond, how old were you when you got your second doctoral degree? I said, 31. And I realized, I'm chasing knowledge, right?
Mhm.
But whatever they were chasing before, they say after this, they come to the realization that what this is all about is learning to love. That and that people say that there's no more fear of death because they say, well, I mean, I was on the other side and it's more real than this, right? And that afterward, they come back with the commitment to try to learn to love others. And as I'm sure you will attest to, it doesn't make it that much easier. Dr. George Ritchie was saying to me one
No.
day, he said, Raymond, he said, this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden in a way. Now, George was a very kind hearted person. And this is to my translation of what, because I've heard the same sentiment from a lot of people. What that means is, even after you see this vision of sheer light and the essential quest for love, you said it doesn't make it much easier. And that the way I would put it is, let's face it, it's very difficult to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person, right? And that doesn't go away. So, but what it does, it sets them off on this path
Yeah.
and they do great. I mean, you know Eben. I mean, look at the transformation in that man. It's like having a 50 something year old or 60 something year old friend who's a kid. I mean, he's so brilliant and he's just so youthful. I mean, so it's great.
Yeah, he's got what I call his heart is cracked open. There's a book inside of us still working to come out called The Open-Hearted Warrior. And you don't need an NDE to get it, but the NDE does it. But what I like to say, and I'll bleep it because we're a family friendly show, I put none of this on there. Integration is
That's right. And Plato had that same thought. I mean, he sort of talked about this. It's like when you're ripped away from one kind of dim environment like this one that we're in, and you see this light, it's very hard to come back in.
the person who I think of is Carl Jung, who said, I think to his dying day, get me back there. Why the hell did you bring me back here?
That's right. I just hear so many people. A lot of people feel sort of, what's wrong with me? Because some people they just say, well, you got to go back. It's not your time yet. You got things left to do, and they want to go back, and it's like they feel kind of rejected, like what's wrong with me? And very often people will say, well, there must be something wrong with me. But what happens in the passage of life thereafter, they become aware of what it is that they have to finish, that in time eventually unwinds this, and they say, I finally came to see what I had to do to finish.
So it wasn't a question I was planning on going on, but we might as well go there. If there is the other side, and we have no way to logic it, but we can call it a preponderance of evidence at this point. And people get things like a life review, and I'm going to want to go there in a minute. And then people get sent back here. If you look at the preponderance of the evidence, what do we come up with as the meaning of life?
Well, you know what this is. I mean, I'm a medical doctor and forensic psychiatrist ultimately, but I still and here my formative things was astronomy and philosophy, okay, and comedy. And what this is all about to me, it's very complicated to say, but when you look at the history of that question, what is it that constitutes our unique personal identity? Plato said it's the immaterial, immortal soul. Difficulties arose with that. John Locke said, oh, it's our memories. What Raymond Moody says, and in 2021, after hearing this from thousands of people, is that Elie Wiesel was right when he said, God made man because he loves stories. And what is your personal identity except for your story, right? And so the meaning of the story is you're learning to love. and it's a process. You mentioned the life review. That's what people learn kind of in their life review.
Can you tell us more about a life review and what that is and what people experience?
Yeah, well, a very typical unfolding in this. People say that when they hear the doctor say, "Oh my God, he's dead," and then I hear often people all over the world say something like, as one woman put it, she said, "Dr. Moody, I have never been so alive as when I heard that doctor say I was dead." Okay, so they're out of their body. They kind of realize that nobody can see or hear them. They go through a passageway into a light. They see their deceased relatives and friends around them. And then they say, time stands still. Everything else kind of disappears. And you're surrounded by, for want of a better term, a hologram, right?
Mhm.
In which there's no time, but you are seeing everything you have ever done at once, in the company very often of a being of complete compassion and love who sees all this along with you, and yet loves you completely. And people say that in this panorama, that when you see everything you've ever done and you remember doing it, and you also see it simultaneously from the point of view of the other people with whom you've interacted, and you feel their feelings. Hence, if you see yourself doing something mean to somebody else, which we all have, you feel directly the hurt feelings. Or if you see yourself doing a kind hearted thing to somebody else, you feel the good feelings. And people say that during in the parts of this where they've been learning something, they say this being kind of focuses on this. None of this is words, but they say that the thought that comes is, even after you come over here permanently, that will go on. That this pursuit of knowledge is something that is doesn't stop when you die. It goes on and on. And so then at some point, all this, then they have to come back to their bodies. But this hologram thing, is, I mean, I am so picky about drawing inferences,
Yeah.
Michael, because I was a professor of logic. Logic is a great thing. In our society, we have, logic is way over here on one end, and spirituality is way over here on the other end. Historically, that's just not correct. I mean, logic itself, according to its inventor, came here from the other side. That's where he says he got it. Now, what I mean is that what we can draw as an absolutely cinch of an inference from this. I mean, it's just no other way to say it except this is. And let's think the idea of an afterlife aside for the moment. But what can we infer with certainty from this fact of these life reviews, which is startling in itself, which is, for at least some of us,
Yeah.
life is a two-phase process, right? We lead it forward as the actor or protagonist. Then we go 180-degree turnaround. Time stands still, and you see the same action from the point of view of the other characters. And to me, that's utterly mind-bending. And yet, it's a completely firm inference.
It makes me think, and I want to go back to the life review, but I and you, we like to geek out in this lifetime as well. When that comes, it will come, and we'll be flying and partying on the other side. We'll probably get there in a minute, because we've heard stories of all of a sudden people going, "I had no legs and I was flying over the Himalayas." but but here and now, can't we, I don't like using the word strive because that gets to chasing, but can't we start to train ourselves to live the two-phase process now, to have greater empathy, to look at each situation and get outside of ourselves? And how would that change things?
Yeah, yeah. Now, see, Michael, I've come to realize that Elie Wiesel was right. This thing we're in is kind of a theater, right? And that the trouble with it is you can go through a mental process and you can say, yeah, Elie Wiesel is right. I mean, one thing I see when I did a year of geriatric psychiatry, these were again, the movers and shakers in this town. I mean, the chief of police and the mayor, they can't go in the front door like everybody else. So, and I was older. So, and already was known for this book. So I was the one, to run that clinic. And constantly throughout that year, I heard, it's like Dr. Moody, the older I get, the more I have this uncanny feeling when I look back at it. The whole thing has been a play or a movie or a drama or a story, is whatever word they used. And that's correct. And however, the characteristic of this story is that it's immersive. I mean, what happens to me, I can go through the mental process and then a kind of physical, like in a kind of philosophical reverie, I can hold that thought, and then some personal annoyance intrudes, right? Like the I mean, whatever it is, it's like some annoyance, and you are immediately drawn back into the immersion of it, which is supposed to how it's supposed to be. Plato said that our situation in the world is like we're horses with blinders, right? And the point of that is, it's just too overwhelming. You've got to have some sort of filtering mechanism just to get into the story. Because what your life is a story. Go into your consciousness and see that your consciousness is narrative, isn't it? Because whenever something new happens to you, what do? You weave it into your life story. So, what this is all about is a story that's unfolding, and that at a certain point of life you realize that, and and that's why we have the theater. I think, I mean, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, they were thinkers like you and me, right? So they just realized, yeah, that's what old people say, that when you look back, it's been a story. Well, we can flatten out a place here on the ground and condense these,
Yeah.
and
And
so these are stories.
And I think we can learn from this and learn from the fact that people have life reviews. We can learn that if we can see that it's a story, if we can see that there's an arc. I love going back to there was a animated movie maybe a decade ago called Big Hero 6. And all these kids are troubled and, there's robots taking over the world and bad guys and stuff. And they all come together as a group and they look at how they've, quote, failed. And they go, that's it. This is our backstory for greatness. If we can separate ourselves from the story.
Yes, that's right. And it's hard. And the trouble is, if you get, what I find is I can have this in little flashes of insight. And eventually, where I am now is that all the time I can see it as a story, and yet at the same time feel the immersion too. It's kind of
Yes.
like you get into a double level of consciousness where you can be watching this story unfold, and seeing it that way, and then also being the inside the character and not able to. I mean, things are annoying, or they hurt, or but that's what it is. It's like different from the movies in the sense that when you sit in the theater and you watch the character and a brick falls on his toe, well, you may wince and sort of sympathize, but you don't feel the pain.
When we go to a life review on the other side, and people are shown this and people are shown feeling others' emotions, and unless you're a saint, and probably even then, we hurt people. It's not that we're original sinners or anything, but as a Buddhist monk once told me, when you put your foot down, you kill microscopic creatures. There is nothing we can do that pleases everyone for a lifetime. So we get the life review. Are our hearts broken because we're in a place of total love? Is there judgment? Is it, I guess no other way to put it, if you have a certain life review, is there heaven versus hell?
There is judgment, but insofar all the cases I've seen, it comes from the person, because people say you're in the presence of this completely compassionate, loving being. And you see things you've done that you feel guilty about. But the perspective of God is you were learning even then, right? But your perspective is being down on yourself. And the people in the very fundamentalist religions, they are very kind of taken aback with this. My dear friend George Ritchie said he was 20 years old. Was pronounced dead for 9 minutes back in 1943. And George said there he was. He had been raised in this very, harsh fundamentalist Presbyterian religion. And he said, let's put it this way. He said, I was 20 years old, but I'd had a very active sexual career at that time. And he said, not all of it with the opposite sex. And, this was 1943. And so there he said he was trying to hide that and like keep, and he said, to my, even in 1976, George came over to my house one night and he was recounting that and looking back. And he said, so I was prepared for, this is hell stuff. And his eyes brightened up and he said, but he didn't even mention them. Right. And so it's not when I was living in Charlottesville in 68, 67 or 68, Michael, as a graduate student of philosophy, a Broadway musical comedy came through, and I don't remember which one, but it was just for one night, a New York touring company. So my wife and I went. We were on the front row. Okay, so and I don't remember the name of the play, but one of the characters in it was wonderful comic villain, complete with the black high top hat and the black cape. And he was just so calculated meanness all the way through. Well, then the curtain went down. The show ended. The curtain went down. Then the curtain calls. Right. First, the hero and heroine come out. Yay! I mean, just huge cheers went up and clapping. Then the supporting actors and actors came out. Hooray! Cheers, just building and building and building. And then the villain came out and silence. I mean, I was
Played
sitting on
his
the front
role
row.
well.
That's right. I was sitting on the front row, so it felt like it went on for an eternity. I'm just sure just a couple of seconds. But then all of a sudden, in pockets behind you, you're what God is interested in is education and love, is what I think.
So I want to get to God in a second. So what we're going to do, I want to cover one question, then we're going to go to God, then we're going to go to the latest science and really geek out on this. But I said something I want to double back to in regards to the villain. Played his role well. How does life change if we understand that everyone is spirit and human form playing a role, playing their own story and a story that interacts with our story?
Well, and I got to say something about this because this is a big part of my take on it. Since my dad was hostile to religion, he had been a medic in World War II, a surgeon, Pacific theater. I put it together subsequently that must have just really turned him off on religion. So I just didn't get exposed to religion. And my dad was always making sarcastic remarks. Meanwhile, my mother's mother, it was her favorite subject for very gentle humor. So I just, I wasn't raised up in this. So what happened when my dad set up practice in this town in I'm not, but anyway, a little town, where little city, where there was a church on every corner. All right. So my dad, into that environment, he was not very well accepted by except by the Jewish physicians, right? Because to them, questions, So, for this period of my life, I was about from 7 to
Mm-hmm.
12 or something. All of our friends were Jewish because the Jewish, and plus I'd had my favorite aunt was Jewish. And, I just, she was the greatest person to me. So I, that's where and my Jewish friends weren't religious either, but they talked about these things. And so from that point of view, see, I can't get into belief. I mean, I realize that I, Raymond Moody, am a limited human being. Any belief that I could form about God would be bound to be off base. And plus, people say, well, do you believe that God exists? And I say, no, absolutely not. Because number one, I can't form any belief about God. But number two, if you think of the emphasis of that sentence, falls on the word exists, right? As a logician, it'd take about an hour, but I could take you through and I can show you what it means to say that something exists. I could even show you the symbolism for it. But when it comes to God, I mean, God is bigger than existence itself. When you wonder whether God exists, you're trying to draw a circle around God. Think about that. And you call that exist. That's ridiculous. What I say is, I have a relationship with God. And see, that's how I came to me. To me, it's just like I pray every day. It's like, and it's a living relationship.
So I'm going to double back to the original part of the question, and then we're going to the he on the other side. If we're playing a story, if God is, if existence is, then I guess where I'm going, I'm leading the witness. Should we be dropping the judgment on everyone and everything? We can choose what we want. We can choose what we don't want. We can choose to make the better world. We can choose to make the darker world. But pointing the finger at anyone for anything is not understanding the big picture.
Well, I tell you the truth, I don't think that that's possible for me to achieve anyway in this. I have hard trouble. What are they talking about? Forgiveness, right? I mean, these are hard things for me. So psychologically, I can't make that step. I don't know. I can't imagine that I could get out of that judgmental framework within this. But that's up to God. I mean, maybe God wants me to. I think that we're here. It's like I ask people, Michael. I've asked people this for years now, many audiences, and I paint a scenario. I say, okay, let's say that you were diagnosed with a horrific infection that caused you to, it would require that you were isolated by yourself on a desert island, nobody else for, say, 10 years. And they can take you out there in a cargo plane with all the food and water and medicine you need for those 10 years. And in the back, there's a little area where they can put on a DVD player and let's say 5,000 DVDs, right? And so what I ask people is, would you choose all comedies? Right. Well, over the years, I've asked this before people, audiences of well, hundreds or thousands. Only three people have ever said, yeah. Right. And I say, and I don't know what was wrong with them exactly, but but then you ask the other, would you choose some tragedies too? Yeah, yeah. And so I say, well, when you were watching that tragedy on that desert island, would you be crying? And they say, well, sure, that's the experience of a tragedy. And so what I'm getting at is that to me, it's like before we come in here, Plato says, before you meet this person who shows you this, sounds like a flat screen with all the different patterns of life you could take. And you're given a choice, you go through a process of what pattern of life you want to choose for whatever reasons. Then you come over here and you forget it instantly. See, you just come into it. Some people have a little bit more memory of it, right? But the point of the blockade of the memory is that you've got to, while it's going on, it's got to seem real, right? I mean, you've got to make the education work. You got to be kicking and screaming, and because you forget you chose it, and so I think that's kind of how it works, and yeah.
Thank you. So let's go to the he on the other side. You referenced the he. In fact, you shared a story a few minutes ago, and he showed him a life review. Who or what is on the other side, even if we don't have a word for it? Is it God? Is it spirit? Is it everything? What are people experiencing?
Well, yeah, good. It's Eben, who's a mutual friend, Eben. I was talking with him about this. Number one, we know full well, and Eben, we all know that it's not time and space, right? But the language requires
let me
that
let me
we.
pause you for a second, because that is so important. Like if we take the tunnel, there's a concept of going up the tunnel, of we make it a concept of moving through time and of having a voyage. And what you're saying is there is no time and space. We're trying to wrap our minds around it.
That's right. That's right, and it's but the only terminology is available is time space time terminology. People say, well, there was no time and no space, but what happened was I got out of my body and went through a tunnel into the light. I met my deceased relatives, saw my life in review, came back to my body and returned to life. That's a travel narrative. But what sense does a travel narrative make if there's no time and space? It's like Lincoln when he was president, it was a very formal state ceremony, right? Forgot what it was about, but his part in the ceremony calls for him to climb up on a horse, to mount the horse, and to lead the procession away from the scene on horseback. But when he got up, all the people gathered around, and he got up on the horse. But when he did, the horse picked its own back hoof up and got it stuck in the stirrup. So the horse was bouncing around and everybody shocked into silence. Oh, how embarrassing for the president. Just like complete silence. But Lincoln looked down at the horse and said, well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off. And everybody else just dissolved into laughter. Well, we can see that's nonsense,
Mhm.
but nonetheless it brings a very vivid image of the in the mind of that very thing, right? And so that's what it's all we the language is not adequate, but that's exactly what we'd expect. It makes sense if you go to some other dimension of existence and you try to put that into words, that what comes out is nonsense, right? But that's okay. Dr. Seuss has sold 600 million copies of his books. I mean, people like nonsense, obviously, when it's a good thing.
So then going back into a sense of non-time and space, for instance, Eben, and take us through there.
What he answered, and this is kind of what I've come up with too. He said, here it's the time space axes. There it's the axes, insofar as you can explain them, are number one, love, and number two, information or knowledge. And isn't it interesting? Freud said happiness is the capacity to love and to work. Well, I mean, I don't call my work work because it's my fun, but you know what's to me is the pursuit of knowledge, right? So it's yeah, and people say that I've had the people with extremely lengthy cardiac arrest. I've got maybe a dozen of them at least who said they see this other dimension of existence, which is just kind of like a think tank or a superpowered university. George said, you try to imagine Caltech and MIT and Yale and Harvard and Princeton and all of them squeezed into one. You can't even get a vague idea of this place. And yet, that even after we die, the process of learning goes on.
I'm almost getting tired thinking about it, Raymond, because knowing you and knowing me, oh my God, are we going to be scooping up knowledge left and right and going, give me all you got?
That's right. That's right. One of the things George said in this area that he saw into, he said it was like you could compare it to a library. And he said there was one area of this library, aspect of it, which recorded the holy books of the universe. Now, I want to look up the number and the card catalog as soon as I get over there. That's where I want to go, right?
Absolutely. So now take us through. I'm curious. Latest research. What have we learned about NDEs since you started going down this road, and what's blowing your mind the most?
Well, I think the most important thing for people to know when they take this seriously is that conceptually it's hopeless. I mean, we can't solve the afterlife question with the mind as we have it and the logic as we have it. And we can't solve it just by hearing many more and more stories. The stories are very inspiring, and I've heard thousands, and I can't wait to hear the next one, right? But as Plato pointed out, we have to have a story, but even if we had a million stories, that wouldn't add up to a proof of an afterlife. And what he said, we need some set of concepts. Well, I'm saying that the concepts we need are how to think about things that don't make sense. And has a lot of practical applications in other areas of life too. Commercial for advertising, medical. It's like one thing I learned in my medical training was I had already sort of realized early in life that there's different types of nonsense. And by studying Dr. Seuss and Edward Lear and um, what's his name, Beckett, Samuel Beckett, and Lewis Carroll. I read them all, and I realized that there's different types of nonsense, right? When I started going around the wards in medical school and realizing quickly that patients talk nonsense, people who are delirious, for example, talk nonsensically, or people who are schizophrenic, or people who are just severely stressed. They're nothing bad. They've seen something terrible where they're almost killed, and even though they're not injured, they talk nonsense. Just or people who are intoxicated with mercury, for example, talk nonsense. So what that means is nonsense. Now we can train our minds in such a way that unintelligibility is no longer a blockade in our understanding. So this is where this is going. And what I'm saying is you can actually reformat your mind
Yeah.
in advance in such a way that when you come back, you'll be able to tell the rest of us um, in a whole new way. And that's happening now.
So,
It's
and that's you've shared your book, Making Sense Out of Nonsense, and now some people have crossed over and come back and said, wait, I was given a formula. I was given, well, for instance, if I'm teaching somebody about, or any of the great teachers are teaching somebody about lucid dreaming, you have some sort of a remembrance device. Like you look at your watch many times, or you put your hand on the doorknob to remind you. This is a technique so that your brain is rewired.
yeah. That's right. So it prepares you. I mean, I don't want to totally emphasize the life after death aspect because it has medical implications. Attorneys have used it. People who are in the advertising business but one of the implications it has is that now it enables us to talk about this in a new way. And then it has to do, Michael, with we all know, everybody knows that it's 4.3 light years to Alpha Centauri. But if you ever stop to think, well, how did they figure that one out? I mean, you can't put a odometer on a homing pigeon's, foot and well, how did they know? Well, in the early, I think it was about 1838, they got up to the point where the instruments were accurate enough that they realized that it's 186 million miles across the orbit of the Earth
Mhm.
around the sun. And so, when the Earth is here in its orbit, they would carefully measure the angle to the nearby stars, wait 6 months later to when it was on the opposite side of the Earth's orbit, and you can see there would be a tiny little difference, right? Well, that gives you the distance out there. And now we have a similar analogous method to use with near death experiences. We already have a lot of cases of near death experiences that are formulated through the Aristotelian
Mhm.
lens of literal language, which makes it a travel narrative. But now we realize, just a minute here, it doesn't make sense to say that it's a travel narrative. So when you go into your near death experience already knowing this, you're going to reformulate it. And that gives us over here viewed through the lens of Aristotelian logic, over here viewed not just through the lens of Aristotelian logic, but also from extra logical principles. And now we got parallax. It's like what I think I've done is I've opened the door a crack. And I haven't pushed the door open further after that, but I've developed a sort of way that we can peer through that crack a little bit, see? And what it does, it takes fun. I mean, I've got these exercises. I've taught the students how to um, recognize different types of nonsense. What is he talking about? Well, here we go. Um, 'Twas brillig the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. That's nonsense. But now listen to this. Holiness breathes the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. That's nonsense too, but just something different. Then now listen to this. Number three, That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county. Nonsense too, but a different. Or hat thoroughly the if that's how Zoom, another type, or and we got and but once you see the common pattern of structure of all the types of nonsense, then it opens. My students say that as they work these exercises, they write the different types, and they say that they can actually feel the wheels turning in their mind in a whole new way, that it opens up a little crack so we can peer into the afterlife. I mean, this sounds so kind of psychotic, I know, but the reason I'm spouting off on this is that I know full well that anybody who goes through this is going to see it for themselves. It's like that's what unanimously happens. Everybody says, "Yeah, I see."
And if you're by somebody's side and they're crossing over, particularly if they're going slowly, you start to see or hear them speaking quote unquote nonsense more and more.
Yes, indeed. It's like that's one of been the yes, one of the most common characteristics. I've been teaching this stuff and developing it since 1969, so I've got a lot of student commentary. But it's one of the things that people say is that I never was the same after this. I mean, it's like they say that you see nonsense everywhere, and that before it had been invisible to you, but now you see it everywhere. And not only that, you see the structure of it. You see what type it is, and you know how to think about it. See, and that will be have benefits for a lot of fields. Like a lot of medical doctors, I've taught this and said it helps understand their patients or whatever. So, it's just a matter of reformatting our minds, and we can do it.
Thank you. So I want to know where people can go to find out about that. And then we're going to kind of do a speed round on some cool NDE stuff to wrap things up. So, where can people go to find making sense out of nonsense and God is bigger than the Bible and all the rest of your work?
Well, life after life, of course, is everywhere, but the Making Sense of Nonsense was published about a year ago by Llewellyn Press, and you can find it on Amazon. And the new one, God is Bigger Than the Bible, was just published on Amazon. You can get it on Amazon too. And it's the God is Bigger Than the Bible kind of builds off Making Sense of Nonsense. You can you can read Making Sense of Nonsense and work the exercises in it, which are fun, and that reformats your mind in such that what I'm doing is I'm conducting a sort of collective study. And you can join in with the study of the afterlife and near death experiences just by reading, Making Sense of Nonsense, and writing the exercises. And then I go more in God is Bigger Than the Bible. I go more into describing the study I'm doing now.
Last thought on this. I love the term that you just used is phenomenal because if we bring it to NDEs, that's what happens. Your mind is reformatted. So it's like the SD card has been reformatted, and you come back here. You may still have vestigial memories, but you've been reformatting. If we learn how to reformat the mind, how much does that change everything?
Well, I can only go on, say, mostly say from 1970 to now. It's 50 years I've had experience with this, and the course got more complicated, bigger over the years. But I mean, I just still get, you know, communications from students I had decades ago and saying how well, let me give you some examples. It's like there was this one guy who owned a car dealership and very successful, just like endless money. And he had been a student of mine at East Carolina University in the about early 70s. And, just a few years ago, he got in touch with me. He said, "Oh, Raymond, it's like all of my success came from what I learned in that class." One of the ways he was saying that he had used it was he made these business cards that were nonsense. And he said they became a rage. Everybody wanted the latest one. I mean, and then I had this other guy who was an artist, he used to come in with that big leather zip thing that artist kids always carry around, and he would come to class every day. He just loved graphic arts. And so, anyway, and so sadly for many people who love art, he couldn't make his living with that. So he ended up a bureaucrat at the VA. And a few years ago, he wrote me and he said, Dreaming, he said, like one of the things he did with his art from the course was he made this. You see these prints of the Ten Commandments, right? And it's like the two tablets, and on the one side it says it's Roman numerals. It goes down 1 to 5, and then on the next side it goes down 6 to 10, and all. Everybody knows that image. So he said he created that image and put it on his wall in the VA. And he said over the years, it's just like infinite comments, people coming in. And he said the comments fell into two categories. Some of them was, oh, I'm so glad to see there's a Christian in the VA, right? And then the other people would say, oh, it's like, is it legal to put that in here? So he said, but those were the main reactions. But he said, nobody ever got so far as to read it and to see it was just nonsense. Thou shalt not Katepana or Ratata or whatever. It's just nonsense. So it's like my point is I've just had a lot of students over the years who have a lot of different um, reactions. But what people say is it opens your mind and the world is never again the same.
You. So let's, speaking of the world no longer again the same, I want to do a quick speed round on NDEs with you and get your first take on each of these questions. First off, who do people meet on the other side?
Well, what people say is that the first people they meet are their deceased relatives. And they say it's not that you see a body because there's no physicality anymore. There is a kind of form, but you know these people through their memories and the personal sense of presence. So that's who you see. And some people say, or they see this being of light. Some people say it's Christ. Some people say it's God. Some people say it's a being of light who's completely love. And so, those are that's generally what people say, at least in this first part of it.
Okay, a couple more questions on that. What is the age of the people that we meet?
Oh yeah, this is something I've heard from all over the world. Michael, is people say that they don't appear to be any age. It's like it. Some people have said it's just like I've heard a number of people say over the years about the age of 30. But they say it's like the prime of life is the phrase people use all over the world.
How about for parents who have lost, well, we've had three miscarriages, or for others who have lost infants?
Yeah, well, that happened to me in 1970. He was 36 hours old, and I'm still
Oh, I'm so
in.
sorry.
Yeah, well, you know the feeling, and and so what I can say is, I that's all taken care of. I mean, it's like people say they go through this life review, and it's okay, I get it, and I haven't been there yet, but I know from people who've have that that's what happens.
So, do they meet their babies, and how old are their babies?
Here's the most interesting story along those lines. The woman was named Vi Horton, and I met her in 1974 and knew her for a long time thereafter. And Vi was 35, I think, or when she had her near death experience, which came from a 40-minute cardiac arrest that she
Wow.
suffered during gallbladder surgery. And she said that as she went down this tunnel and she was coming into the scene, she said that she saw her mother who had died, and she said that there was this other person there that she didn't recognize, and this was a fully developed, I mean, in the sense that makes sense that he was a person in the prime of life, and she said that's how she saw him. But then she said, I'll show her gestures. She said when she got up to him, he did like this. If you can try to imagine that people are made of cellophane layers, right? And she says he took off that layer and showed her himself to her as an infant. And her mother, who was there, said, and the brother did too, that she never knew she had a brother, right? And so she said what happened was it was explained that uh, Vi had two sisters, right? And she was the youngest of the three sisters. But before that, they had a male child, her mother and father, who died young as a baby. But she saw him as he was as an infant. Well, in the 1930s, people didn't tell kids about that,
Hmm.
right? It's like this was just hushed up, and they never shared it with the sisters. But like the thought was from her mother, you just talk about this with your father. So when she got back, she said, I met my brother. And, he said, yeah, absolutely. It happened just as she said. So that's maybe the story that comes to mind, but I've heard this a lot that, all this is kind of worked out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Going to do a really fun question here, which is people have met uh, Jesus or Mother Mary or somebody from their religion on the other side. Have people met somebody from other people's religions on the other side?
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I've had over the years two Muslims who said to me that in their near-death experiences they saw Jesus, and which is kind of startling. Except a Muslim friend of mine, or now different, but he said when that makes sense because the Jesus is a big character in the Muslim religion as well.
Wow, cool. How about angels?
Yeah, I hear people say angels. They say not with literal wings, but there's these beings around who just maybe seem to be up a notch from the way you and I are right now, although you're pretty close to it, it seems to me.
Oh,
But well, you are. You're just very sweet. And I mean, we both see that you go through life and you get to the point where this thing separating us kind of thins, right? I mean, I just it's my wife who's very brilliant, Michael. It's her IQ is embarrassingly high. I mean, I'm not going to brag, but it's just amazing. But but fortunately for me, she is not intellectual at all. She went to art school, right? So, and I tell her about philosophy, and she's interested, but it's art for her, it's in fashion. So, and she's 12 years younger than me, but about a year and a half ago, I guess, she was standing in the living room one day and she had this look come over her face like she's really processing. And she said to me, you know, time is unreal. And that's what people it's like if you're a philosophy student, you've always thought about this, or Aristotle pointed out, for example, time. Well, what is it? It's the past, present, and the future. He said the past doesn't exist, the future doesn't exist, and try holding on to the present. I mean, what is it? It's very mysterious. And to me it's necessary for a dramatic encounter, right? Because the story has a beginning and a middle and an end. So we got to have time here. But as I gather that when you go over there, narrative consciousness is no longer a factor. Yeah, and that it's another kind of consciousness.
thank you. Let's go to a real interesting one for a brief second. Similarities between NDEs and psychoactive drugs.
Yeah, well, this I've heard a lot of people over the years who've had NDEs, and a lot of people who've had psychedelic experiences, and there's others who've had them both, right? And what I hear from people who have them both, I mean, it's just a lot of people who have heard this, and
And
that
I would be in the both categories, so I'm very
okay,
interested to
I'm
hear.
interested to what you would say because it's like what people say is that there is a similarity to the point where you have to use some of the same words.
Hmm.
But that doesn't get the whole picture because it's even though the words have to be similar, the experience is different. And so they say, I'm forced to use the same words, but where the near death experience had this quality of being more real than real, whereas the psychedelic experience was more compared to that kind of a let's pretend or tentative thing is the and that's the best I can formulate the words from people who've told me
Yeah.
both. Yeah.
So I've had numerous ayahuasca journeys with a shaman, and I equate that and profound learnings and lessons and I think for anybody who's ready, these experiences can be, and I'm not saying go chase this, never chase it, but if the opportunity is there, it can be completely life transformative. But it is to me a tuning of the dial. It is going from
Yeah.
radio station Earth to radio
Yes.
station The Vine or radio station Earth to
Yeah.
DMT.
That's right.
It is still within this realm
Yes.
and has
That's
one.
great. That's wonderful.
Oh, go ahead.
No, that's wonderful. I never thought about it that way. Thank you, Michael. Yeah.
It's one tenor or one timbre to it that is it is special. It is sacred, and it is actually, to me, these are not hallucinations. You couldn't call it. It is, in a sense, more real than real. It's just a tuning of the dial to another reality, but it is still a reality within this side of a veil. The other thing is the other thing.
Yes, that's a very articulate statement of what I've heard from a lot of people. That's right. That it's analogous, but it's different. It's like one is another dimension, and this is something that happens here that you have to describe it. That's exactly what people say.
So,
Yeah.
how much over this process? Well, actually, let's put it a different way. Are you afraid of death now, or are you looking forward to death?
No, no way am I afraid of death. However, I am afraid of life. I mean, there's a lot of scary things.
That
And
is
what
so
I
perfectly
think
put. I'm with you.
yeah, when I think about it, the main thing that worries me is pain. I don't want any pain in the process. And that's part of my prayers every day. Dear God, guide me gently through to a painless, peaceful, pleasant death on your schedule. Now, in the past, I've tried to hurry God up, but now it's no. I let God work out this story. And plus, I got two wonderful kids who are still at home. I got four kids in total and a grandson, but we got the two young ones, Carter, you met, and
Yeah.
Carol Ann, who are still home. And I think, well, I want to be around for them, to get them on their way. And so there's that kind of thing. And yet, I'm not afraid of death. No, my problem is more, it's kind of like going through periods where I wish it would speed up. But then I think, well, but I've got to the master playwright here is he's got different ideas, and I want to go with his story because I've learned when I try to put my 2 cents worth in, it just goes askew. I got to listen to the playwright on this one.
Yeah, and if you try to rush the story ahead, you only tear the page.
Yes, yes. My best friend for 30 years, Michael, was Milton Friedman, who
Yeah.
you've heard of. But the trouble is that, as my Milton always used to say, there are two Milton Friedmans. One has the economic solution, and the other has the economic problem. And mine was the one with the problem, but he was equally famous. He knew every president since Truman, and he was special assistant to President Ford, and so he was just a very well-known figure. But he always used to get calls for the other Milton Friedman. It's like he said one time in Washington, he got this phone call and said, "Hello, this is Milton Friedman," and it was a woman, a graduate student at Harvard, who was getting her PhD dissertation. And she said, she was calling, she said, "Is this Milton Friedman?" He said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, I'm writing my doctoral dissertation on monetary policy." And she said, "Would you give me a quotation from my dissertation?" And he said, "Sure." He said, "Money can make you rich." And and she said, "Well, can I quote that?" And he said, "Well, sure." But Milton um, was he was res- I know we had this conversation one time, and we were both sort of coming to realize that this near death stuff, I mean, this is apparently real, but he was kind of hoping not, you know? I mean, he was because he had a very tough life. I mean, but it's my point is that now I see it as the story as Aristotle tells us has a beginning and a middle and an end. And I'm not trying to rush the end, but I'm not scared of dying. And I think, different people have different responses to this kind of thing. But yeah.
My my mentor was 89 years young when he was my best man. His name's Jack. And he crossed over, I think, just a little bit before 93 till 92. He was driving the people around in the retirement home. He was the driver of the vehicle of the quote youngsters. And when he got substantial congenital heart failure, I'm like, well, let's work on this. Let's see what we can do. And he's like, damn it, Michael, I want out of here. And what he was saying is, because he was a Course in Miracles guy, he wants to go play on the other side and see what's there.
Yeah, that's right. And what I just see so clearly now. My wife, of course, too, is important, but both of our focus is on the kids, and I just maybe I'm a overprotective dad and a kind of worry wart. So, but it's all over to God. I just say, okay, you take me through this. It's like I'm just
What an important concept, because I'm always talking about God is and of what it really means to surrender. And I still get to work on this one. But if we understand we're not the writers, we may be co creators, but not the writers of the story, it can make things a lot easier.
that's right, exactly. That's what I've reached to, and it's like it's it's hard to get out of that mindset for wanting a well here's an example. Back years ago I was going through it happens recurrently that I don't pray and then I get myself into some trouble, right? Then when it's all then I thoughts of suicide occur, and then how am I going obsessing about it all the time? When I get like this, finally I just turn it over to God, and then it's like poof. And I was telling George Ritchie something like that had happened. I forgot specific thing, and a couple of days later, after I said to George, I said I'd really been, working, and all of a sudden I just said it, turned it over, and he smiled and he said, "Surrender is the most powerful prayer." And I think that's right. I think that's right. Yeah, you gotta turn it over, but it is so scary.
Yeah.
It is. It is. But yeah, it works.
Woohoo! I give this to you.
That's right. And just get this, Michael. Thinking about ego, right? I mean, what I've determined myself from my own psychiatry practice and my own life experience, I know a very simple formula that you will agree with entirely once you hear it is this is ego equals pain, right? It's like what whenever your ego involved, it's always a painful situation. So what I have said is that I'm out of that now, which sounds itself like an egotistical statement, right? Which it would be if I had burned the incense and gone up and laid on the bed of nails. But the way it happened with me was not that way, but it was like I damn near killed myself with it. My particular one was ego. I mean, was jealousy,
Mhm.
right? Well, when you're over with that one, it's like I figured out one ego trip is enough. I mean, it seems so real inside of it, but once you're out of it, and so and yet with all of that, I get into this recurrent thing now. Just think about this for a minute that sometimes I think of something when I want, and then the thought occurs, oh no, I don't want to impose on God. think about it. It's like a polite gesture. Oh, God must be busy, and that's just insane that I, Raymond Moody, have this feeling that I might impose on God. So that's egomania, if anything is.
And I mean, I don't know how to say this in the context of this conversation without it sounding like ego, but and we didn't go there today. But if we are part of the oneness that is everything, then God is us and we are God. It doesn't mean we are the entirety of God. So who are we not to ask for that thing?
Well, that's right. And ego is, I guess, the Greek term for it would be the prosopon, I guess, the character you're portraying. And I knew this very wonderful performer in New York who was, internationally famous, and she contacted me in 1976. I didn't know who she was. I'm very limited in knowing, but it. So I met her not knowing of her fame, which was wonderful. But she was telling me about her near death experience. And she said, Raymond, I was very famous on the stage for this one role. And she said she played that for a long period of time. And she said there was this one night when that was her last performance of that role after years, and she walked off the stage. Flash forward a few years later, she had a near death experience. And she said, the closest way I can describe this to you is it was like that night I walked off the stage, leaving that role behind. And that was kind of what it was like. And I've heard that same thought from other actors and actresses who've had that same thing. It's like that, it's kind of like you're no longer playing this person, right? Plato said, we are God's toys or playthings. And he said, the way you do life is you play at it.
Woohoo! That is everything. All right, last two questions here. People who have had suicides and come back because so many parents are concerned about their kids who have had suicides. What can you tell us about that?
I would say number one, don't do it because I don't know how many people I've talked with near death experiences who had them as a result of suicide attempt, but it's a lot of people, right? And the unanimous message is that they tried suicide, they came back, and they had a near death experience in between. And they said, what I learned immediately was I immediately regretted it because not because they felt like they were going to have some terrible hell, but because number one, it's like they realized that they would see the effects that their action had on their loved one, and they would experience all that pain empathically. And second, another thing I hear all the time is like, and I heard the same turn of phrase from lots of people all over the world. It's kind of like they say it's like walking out in the middle of the movie, that you're always left with that. And also apparently that you got to do it again anyway. I mean, because you're here to sort of learn some things, so you're gonna have to do that anyway. And at the same time, Michael, as when at the adults that I know well enough from years of acquaintance with them to be able to make this judgment, they're all committing suicide. I mean, I'm going the cholesterol route. My wife is going the cell phone on the highway route. And I have friends who are drinking themselves to death or smoking themselves to death. So what? The Lord of the universe is gonna say, they're at the reception center. Oh, you took 30 minutes by pills, you go to hell. Oh, you took 30 years with cigarettes, so you get a pass. I don't think so. I mean, what we're talking about is self-destruction, and that gets everybody in. So, but I would say don't do it. Everybody says it's just, it gets you nowhere.
But
That's
for
right.
parents, their kids will still be all right if they have. If we've lost, so forget about parents. I've known people who've lost a spouse, who've lost a parent. No matter what the age, they will be all right on the other side.
That's right. That's right. And that's really hard. I mean, and the great villains of history, I'm just, it's beyond me. I don't know. I don't know enough to know that, but I'm talking in the general runs of folks. this is going to come out all right. But that doesn't mean it's not scary as hell right now. Or it's like my daughter, my Native American daughter. Okay, she's a few years ago. We went to the Six Flags in Atlanta, and we stood in the line to go on the roller coaster for like an hour. And I didn't go. I was just standing there with my not me roller coaster, right? And I was sort of thinking about this, standing there for an hour for an experience where you know full well in advance that when you're upside down and going at 90 miles an hour, you're not going to want to be there. And, that's how we're set up, right? Or at least I'm not roller coasters are not for me. No. But I'm happy that my kid enjoys them.
I love it. Any last words of wisdom you want to share? Raymond, this has been so much fun. I'm a kid in a candy store. We can keep talking and talking and talking. But in this case, I get to wrap it up for today. Any last words of wisdom you want to share with people?
Well, yeah, thank you so much for listening in. And, this is just philosophy is what I do. And this is the big question of philosophy. And so I would just say thanks to everyone for listening. And, I'm always happy to be with folks who are concerned with these same big questions of existence than I am. And how delightful to be with you, Michael.
It so goes both ways, Raymond. It so goes both ways. So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get God is bigger than the Bible, and making sense of nonsense.
Making sense of nonsense. Absolutely right.
And begin diving into life after life today. And above and beyond all else, shine bright. Woohoo! What a special, sacred, I don't even have the words for it. Raymond and I were just riffing on this topic, but it's interesting when you look at the breadth of information of NDEs and you look at the similarities and the stories, and you start to understand that life really is a play. And I love that he brought up that Plato says that the best way, I can't get the expression right, but is to play life. That seems to be the overarching statement of everybody who comes back from an NDE, is that is more real than real. And there is a realness to this, but we get to experience it. We get to dive into it. We get to live life to the fullest. And so I am so thankful for Raymond Moody coming on the show today. On that note, if you want to make sense of nonsense, if you want to literally converse with the other side, get your copy of Awe, the automatic writing experience, where you can quite literally learn how to peel away or open up the veil and get messages from the other side for guidance, for living a greater life, for going into that state of surrender. In a sense, almost being able to see what's next, or at least to navigate your way through life easier. What's automatic writing? It's a process where you go quiet. You get into a meditative state. You put pen to paper, write out a few prayers, and then the words from Spirit, from Source, from the universe, from God, from the angels, or simply from your inner wisdom begin to flow about you, about your purpose, your path, your direction, why things are taking place. You can converse with the universe, ask any question you want. You can literally even learn how to converse with your loved ones on the other side. To get your copy of Awe, you can go to automaticwriting.com, or of course you can go to Amazon, you can go to Barnes & Noble, you can go to Nook, you can go to any other bookseller. Bring your receipt back to automaticwriting.com to get tons and tons of bonuses. I love saying this. I recommend not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 copies of Awe. Get one for yourself. Get one for a loved one so they don't steal your copy of Awe. Get a third one for somebody in need, somebody really, really struggling on this side of the veil, to help lift that heaviness up off of them. And most importantly, get a copy for your local library so that everybody can learn how to dive into Awe, the automatic writing experience. Again, automaticwriting.com. Thank you guys so much for watching today. To check out more amazing videos, oh, before I do that, come join us Sunday night for our YouTube Live, where we dive even more into this. We dive even more onto how you can improve and change and uplift your life, particularly around the topics of angels, of energy, and of manifestation. Join us for our Sunday night YouTube Live. Do that by subscribing below, clicking on that bell icon to be notified of our lives, plus all of our upcoming shows. Click here to check out more amazing shows. Big thumbs up if you like this. Leave your comments below. Love you guys so much. Shine bright. Woohoo! See you on the other side. A lot later, that is. Love you guys.